Well, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Ben Zeisloft. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Yeah, we'll jump right in. It is clear that the classical conservatism that a lot of us, not me especially, but many people grew up with, the kind of kitchen table values, has somewhat been done away with. And here I'm speaking specifically about the LGBTQ, all of that. The conservative right has somewhat adopted the LGB in the wake of Trump's election and kind of surrounding that whole situation. Although they are leaving out the TQ. Where did we kind of start to lose our path here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've certainly noticed that as well, where it seems like the conservatives are conserving the victories of the liberals from 10 years ago. Where even 10 years ago, we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of Obergefell. That was highly controversial in the Republican world. Now, in the past couple of years, you can see polls where the majority of Republican voters are in full support of same-sex marriage, right? So-called same-sex marriage. So really, it's been the trend of conservatism for the past several decades to just conserve the victory of whatever the left did 10 years earlier. So I think we're unfortunately seeing the same thing play out right now. Even though the right is ascendant and there's a lot of conservative momentum, it's only really being applied to the most severe elements of the LGBT of the TQ in the LGBTQ.
Right.
But I think we need to keep pushing and we need to keep reversing the clock. And I think that whole, even though there's a lot of internal contradictions in LGBTQ, they all come as a package deal. It's just degeneracy, unrighteousness, and needs to all be opposed rather than just a couple of the more extreme manifestations.
Yeah, especially where at the moment we just saw President Trump sign the I think it was a bill that eliminated men from women's sports, which is great and exactly what we want. But it seems to be. I'm curious. Do you think it's more of a turning back the clock, or is it more? I feel like conservatism used to be linked to Christianity in a more direct manner than it is at the moment. I think right now it's more linked to classical liberalism from 30 years ago
Right.
than it is Christianity. Do you think we've lost that link, and if so, how do we get it back?
Yeah, absolutely. I see that as well. I think you hear the phrase common sense a lot in the conservative world. Trump himself has certainly said it. A lot of Republicans say it. Even in Canada, Pierre Poilievre and some of their conservative leaders have been. I think it's currently his campaign slogan is common sense. So the problem is that common sense isn't necessarily common for us fallen human beings, right? 30 years ago, 50 years ago, it would have been common sense to say that a man can't marry another man. It's just not possible. That's not what marriage is. But the ground has shifted so quickly under us to the left that even that is considered common sense. That somebody can quote unquote love who they love, and even most Republicans would agree with that. And I think you're exactly right. I think the reason it's all happening is because we're unmoored from base reality, which is the world God made, articulated especially in Scripture, also in the Book of Nature that you can read through the lens of Scripture. And we're hurtling toward the pit of hell. Even if we tap the brakes a little bit over the next 4 years, that's not seeming to stop.
How do we change that value system so that we get back to the conservatism that's linked to Christianity?
That's an excellent question. I think we're seeing some first fruits of people realizing that you need some Christianity or something like Christianity as a binding civilizational force. If you look at somebody like Joe Rogan, who is decidedly not Christian, he's gone from interviewing atheists, a couple of years ago and thinking they were the most profound people in the world, to making fun of atheists with Wesley Huff when he was on his show, and kind of acknowledging. I think he did say at one point in the past few years, like, we need Jesus to save the West. Now, he doesn't mean Jesus of Nazareth, the one who's ascended to the right hand of the Father and ruling and reigning for all time. He means just the fact that historically the West has needed Christianity to have a bedrock of moral sanity. But I think we need actual, true biblical Christianity to make a comeback. Instead of just assuming it as a foundation, as the West did for so long, it needs to be actively brought back. Of course, the social elements, the way in which it causes society to cohere, just because it affirms the world God made, that's all very important. But really, it needs to come from the heart. So we need more and more of that in the Republican Party and beyond.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins famously said that he is a cultural Christian, even if
Right.
he is not religiously a Christian. It's interesting. I'm curious, where do you think that came from? Because for me, I can at least tie it back to Jordan Peterson. You mentioned Joe Rogan believing that Jesus needs to save the West more as an idea than perhaps a real person, which I think can be linked back to Jordan and potentially then from him to some of his favorite philosophers. The idea that Jesus is not a real human, but more a goal to aspire to, something to steer us forward, which he is, but he also happens to be a real person. Where do you think that? Where do you think that kind of uh, misconception started from?
Yeah, it's. I think a lot of what we're seeing is currently a pendulum swing back towards sanity, but maybe not as far as we need to go, as we're saying. So if you look at somebody like Elon Musk, who's also called himself a cultural Christian, if you look at what he's gone through for the past few years, one of his children were trans in California. So that he's even come
Yep.
out and said, I think to Jordan Peterson, that's kind of the reason why he's waging this war against
Right.
wokeness. And he's again like he's called himself a cultural Christian, and I think it's not so much because he thinks the Bible is true or should be obeyed in his life, but because he realizes that it's powerful to combat some of these things. And I think it was Jared Longshore who used this analogy in a talk, but if there's a coffee shop that's suddenly getting robbed and there's only one guy in the coffee shop with a gun, some people are going to start gravitating toward that guy with the gun because he's the only one who can actually defend everybody around them. That's sort of what we're seeing with Christianity, where just because of the height of the insanity, there are some people who are not going as far as they could go and are looking backward over their shoulder and saying, okay, maybe we've made a mistake. Maybe there's a yellow light and a red light ahead of us. Maybe we should backtrack a little bit. It looks like that Christian guy, those Christians have it together somewhat. Maybe we should at least hear them out. I think that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think that you're right about everyone kind of gravitating towards it in the moment of some similar to COVID, where everyone was like, suddenly we've waken up, and we need to change something here drastically. But as soon as things get back to comfortable, you kind of lay off, and all right, we can hold off for a minute. How do you think we make sure that in this cultural moment where everyone is realizing something is deeply wrong, how do we go all the way back to, yes, but we need to get to Christianity, not just, okay, there's something wrong with society, why don't we just go back 20 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to depend on Christians to do that. So it's tempting, of course, to celebrate the wins, and I think we should celebrate the wins. There are clear wins happening right now. There's deportations. There's executive orders banning men and women's sports. Obvious things that need to happen. But I think we need to constantly be upholding, the eternal standard, not just what's better than what we're currently experiencing, because what we're experiencing is currently pretty bad. So we need to basically uphold what the West has always believed and Christianity has always affirmed as what we actually need to return to. And those are principles that transcend any political moment, and we should be preaching them in season, out of season. And ultimately, it gets back to faith in Christ, of course, and everything sort of gets set right from there. If people are repenting of their sins and believing in Jesus, then things like conservative politics, or like truly conservative Christian conservative politics, are just common sense conclusions. Yeah, of course we shouldn't have baby murder. Of course we shouldn't abuse children and try to switch people's genders.
Right.
So the more that we can, uphold Christ and uphold eternal standards, no matter how unpopular they are, that's what I think moves this society as a whole back in the right direction. I think Christians are the ones who need to do that. Right? Elon Musk is not going to do that. Jordan Peterson isn't going to do that. We need to.
Yeah, point using this moment to, hey, you are noticing something that we have noticed for a long time, that something here is wrong. The only way to fix it, the thing you're trying to get back to, is Christianity, and pointing
Right.
out that like if you really want to be sane again, this is where you need to go. You need to go all the way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that with abortion later on. I will add that one of the big reasons Trump did win is kind of because the conservatism has shifted to more of a just
Right.
simplicity, common sense, as you mentioned. Do you think that sacrifice was worth it to kind of adopt a lot of the LGBTQ? I mean, Stephen Pressler, the gay guy who went around in Arizona getting a bunch of people to go vote for Trump. And he was very instrumental in Trump winning, but he is at the same time someone who is on a moral level deeply opposed to Christianity and the true conservatism. Do you think the sacrifice that we made was worth it, and if so, why or why not?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. If it was worth it, it definitely happened. That was, I think, the big political story last year was the moderation, really not moderation, but leftward shift of the Republican Party in order to expand the coalition. I mean, a lot of us saw it maybe last spring when Trump started having softer stances on abortion, and we realized this is going to cost some evangelical votes. And the evangelical vote for Trump did go down
Yeah.
relative to 2020 and previous years, but other groups went up. He did objectively win over centrists and things like that, and the coalition did broaden. So it's tough because he of course is in the White House, and there are some Christian victories, objective victories being attained, like releasing the 23 pro-lifers who
Yep.
stood outside abortion mills and were targeted under the FACE Act, things like that. But again, I think it's we've seen this play out in other countries too, places like the UK and Canada, where those conservative parties start to moderate and then shift left, and then within a few decades, suddenly something like abortion isn't even on the table. I remember there was a controversy in the UK a couple of years ago because I believe it was their vice. One of the leaders of the Conservative Party was personally pro-life. She didn't actually proclaim those policies out loud. She just happened to think that abortion was wrong, but had no bearing on how she was legislating. And I think that was enough to actually cause significant pressure against her and cause her to lose quite a bit of popular support. So we're heading in that direction as a party, as the Republican Party, and as the United States as a whole. And I do think the Republican Party does need to shift back. That conservative Christian coalition needs to pull back the Republican Party on issues like abortion. It's just tough to see how it's going to play out because the deal is all in some sense already done. We
Right.
already have our RFK Juniors and our Tulsi Gabbards folded into the establishment, and a lot of the Republicans who claim to be pro-life for decades and decades don't really care as much about it anymore now that Roe's over, which I'm sure we'll get into. So it's just tough to see exactly how we do this. Now that the deal has been made.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting in 2028, seeing that election cycle, given that Trump is a very flawed character in many ways, and he is not a moral. He's not a moral person in any sense of the term, and it'll be interesting to see whether in 2028 we kind of get someone who is not conservative but more Christian, and how that will influence and how that'll play out if we do actually get someone more like a J.D. Vance. If J.D. Vance runs, he's going to be running on more Christian values, and it'll be interesting to see if he wins or if he kind of if he doesn't do as well as we would like him to, simply because he is all the way down the road as opposed to just trying to get people part of the way down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, to your point, I think it is possible for conservative Christians to win over that sort of popular support. So if you look at Ron DeSantis, he's a great example. He completely shifted the politics of the state of Florida that used to be a swing state, now is deeply red. And he did things last year, like I was down in Florida to knock doors and raise awareness about Amendment 4. And DeSantis was one of the very few governors in the entire country who actually took a solid stand against those amendments. And he's not an abolitionist by any means, but he's pro life, and he did raise awareness and make sure that that effort failed. And he didn't really lose any popular support for it. Florida was still just as red, if not more so, in 2024 than it was in 2022 or beforehand. So I think it can be done in a certain sense, and I don't think the future of the Republican Party is completely closed off to figures like that. DeSantis' whole principle is not putting your finger into the wind and seeing which way the wind is blowing, but
Right.
actually shifting the culture in the party itself just by being bold and having a backbone and showing leadership. So it's not that the Republicans can't do it at all. It's just will there be an appetite for it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like the reason we are in the Trump campaign, the Trump world that we are in at the moment is because Trump is a little bit finger in the wind, and it'll be. I'm curious. Do you think that sometimes it is worth it to not sacrifice on your morals, but accept that we live in a fallen world and we're going to make the best of a bad situation in order to defeat the greater evil for it, which for Trump was Kamala Harris?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm certainly not going to deny the reality of political pragmatism, but I think in doing so, you just can't cross over certain bounds of God's moral law. Again, going back to what is unchanging, eternal. So if we apply it to something like pro-life legislation, is this bill that claims to be opposing abortion, is it giving partiality to the wicked? Is it establishing justice for the fatherless? Is it regarding faces? Is it being unjust in that sense? Is it using unequal weights and measures? And I would say that you can't commit sin so that good may come. You can't do evil that good may come, as the Apostle Paul says. So I think there is a place for political pragmatism and shifting messaging and even things like that. With as long as you're not crossing those clear moral boundaries that God has set forth.
Right. We're not Machiavellian by any means.
Right.
You mentioned the kind of the loss of the evangelical vote to some extent that Trump had. You yourself were part of that. You mentioned that you did not vote for Trump this election cycle. Looking back on that, do you still stand by that decision?
I do, yeah, and I would have if Harris had won too. And like I said, it's because I was looking at that exchange that was happening, and Trump essentially changing out the pro life priorities of the party in order to broaden the coalition. And I think we haven't seen the full effects of it yet, but I do think in the long term it is dangerous. So that was kind of my calculation. Was saying that we can't just make this purely pragmatic, almost cynical trade for broaden the coalition while sacrificing an issue as important as child sacrifice. So yes, I still get heat for that decision. That's fine. I knew that would happen, but I still stand by it. And even if Harris had won, obviously nobody wanted that, but I would have stood by that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I did vote for Trump just because I thought that while that was dangerous, and I would obviously Trump has been a little more pro-life than he was in his campaign trail, but I would love him to be even more pro-life. But I did see Harris as a more dangerous option than Trump would be, and kind of not voting for Trump would be voting for Harris just because those two were really the only two candidates that kind of mattered in the last election. Who did you end up voting for, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so I wrote in Dusty Devers, who we all know and love,
Yeah.
state senator from Oklahoma, awesome Christian man, and then Bradley Pierce, the president of the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, as
Okay.
vice president. So of course they weren't going to win, but it was those were two candidates who didn't violate my conscience. And then in terms of the just down ballot in Pennsylvania, I did vote for some Republicans. In one case, I voted for the Libertarian because he was a solid Christian, and our Senate candidate in PA was very pro IVF, was bragging about how pro IVF he was during the Senate debate, and that was a bridge too far for me. But yeah, it was a mixed bag, and I've never voted quite like that before. But yeah, that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, it was an interesting situation. If Harris had won, and it had been largely because evangelicals didn't vote for Trump, simply because of that pro-life issue, would you have seen that as a win?
Not necessarily as a win, is because you're given a limited number of cards to play with.
Right.
And I would say again, it's within the bounds of God's moral law. What can and can't you do? So I believe that it was not within the bounds of God's moral law to vote for Trump in that case. So with the cards I was dealt, I had the chance to write somebody in, so I did. So yeah, that was my calculation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure we could dive more into this. It is interesting. You mentioned a lot of the confirmations for Trump's cabinet thus far. RFK Jr., Kash Patel, I don't think has been nominated yet, or confirmed yet, but that is, Lord willing, coming soon. How do you feel about using unrepentant, dirty tools, as it were, in order to kind of bring around a straighter, godlier world?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
In the sense that, like, RFK Jr. is far from a moral man as well, but he is going to, Lord willing, make our food healthier, safer, get the mercury out of the vaccines, make our children more healthy and safe, all of those things. But, like, him, all of the other nominations as well, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, these people, Pete Hegseth is somewhat of an anomaly, but a lot of these people are very unrepentant, very clearly not Christian, but they are more of that conservative, middle of the road, and they are going to bring about a more a straighter, more godly world, even though they are dirty. How do we kind of balance the we are living in a broken world, and sometimes we have to use broken tools with we can't defy our conscience here.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Um, yeah, because there are, like you said, there are objectively really good candidates who Trump is putting forward to fill his cabinet. Hegseth being certainly one of them. Being a Reformed Christian member of the CREC, that sort of thing. Actually, one of my coworkers attends his church, and
Oh, really?
he confirms that he's a good godly man, and
Yeah.
somebody we should be excited about leading our military. It's tough because like even if you look at somebody like RFK, there are issues they're really good on, issues that they're not so good on. So abortion, the question has arisen whether or not RFK would actually take a stand against something like the abortion pill, and I think he kind of said that he would just do what Trump told him to do, during his confirmation hearings, as sort of where he landed on that. But I do think it's objectively good that he would, make real gains in terms of improving the food supply. But yeah, it's really tough because in an ideal world, those would all be positions filled by Christians. If you look at the way our nation started, the state constitutions and the colonies in the early states actually had requirements for office saying that they had to be, Protestant Christians in many cases, or affirm that the Bible was the Word of God and all 66 books were inspired, things of that nature. And we've just shifted so far from that in the United States that we're kind of thrown into a much more confusing environment. It was a lot more binary back then. Will this person take the oath or not? That he agrees with those things. Then it becomes much more clear. So again, I think it's playing with the cards we're dealt, as one constraint, but also another constraint. God's moral law, honoring Him, doing His will. It's not cutting corners morally necessarily in order to achieve a certain end. So I think RFK Jr. is a good example. I would, if I were in the Senate, I probably wouldn't vote for him to be the HHS chair on the on the chance that he's not going to move on something like the abortion pill. Even if I do like what he's doing on with the MAHA movement and improving health, I would probably say to Trump, look, I would support somebody who does that sort of thing, but send us like a Christian who is also against abortion, and then that would move. I think there's actually a couple of Republicans who are sort of saying that would move them toward actually voting for him. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think those are the two constraints where it's God's law and it's the cards we're dealt, and you can't really break your way out of either one.
Yeah, it's a tricky dichotomy, and especially at the moment. Last time Trump was in office, it felt a little more. Well, first off, like he didn't really know what was happening, what he was really doing, but also like it was a little more conservative Christian. And this time, it feels a little bit more, almost like we have, like the true conservatives have not moved, but the Conservative Party has more adopted part of the left than that the left has, than that those people have actually shifted their priorities.
Sure.
Like it feels like those people have stayed roughly where they were. It just so happens that the left has gone so far left that we have somehow adopted them just by the fact that we didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I also wonder when Elon bought Twitter, it became cool to be conservative in a way that it wasn't before. Before it was like the conservatives are always the outcasts, but they're always like we were fine with that because we were like we understand that we must be outcasts in order to fight against this culture that we very sincerely do not want. And then Elon bought Twitter, and it was almost like conservatives became cool. And I'm curious, do you think that part of the reason we've adopted some of the left is because conservatives have never been cool before, and so we don't really know how to handle that, and we're trying to stay cool?
Yeah, I think you do actually see that play out from time to time. So a good example is the state of Florida, where you've seen a number of state lawmakers actually switch their party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. And the question is, are they really doing that because they had this sincere paradigm shift in the space of a few months before and after a single presidential election, or is it that
Most likely not. Yeah.
exactly they know where the shift is going? They know that they're going to lose out on power unless they move with it. Mark Zuckerberg is another great example where suddenly he's basically rebranded himself for the past few months. Ever since Trump's assassination, he has that wavy curly hair and he's wearing t-shirts all the time. And he's also severely changing Meta to be much less censorial and to actually give conservatives a voice. So I think, but again, is he now a social conservative? By no means. He's probably very little change from where he was a year ago. So it's a tricky situation because if we welcome them into our ranks without having the paradigm, while the paradigm is shifting, then we run the risk of shifting actually toward them, all within the umbrella of Republican. So I think maybe one answer is just not elevating those people to leadership. So maybe in that sense, it is somewhat of a mistake to put somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard or an RFK Jr. forward as a cabinet level nominee, rather than saying you're part of this movement, but you're not gonna run, you're not gonna drive the bus. You can sit in the first few
Right.
rows, you can sit somewhere in the middle, and then maybe in a few years, if you stay the course, maybe if you're with us who are driving the bus, you'll shift more towards us and learn how to navigate the roads as we do. But maybe it's not quite the time to put somebody like that in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Do you think that that endangers us to losing future elections and then going down the path of, I guess, where we were headed if Kamala Harris were to win? And is that a risk that we need to take just because sometimes you need to have the pigsty moment in order to become the prodigal son?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, that's a tough question again because it did objectively work to win. The Republicans won the
Right.
election by making that trade. That's what happened. It's not really up for debate. Again, I would default more toward uh, leading by example. Actually, moving the Overton window in your direction. I don't think you do that in the long term by shifting a little bit to the left every time there's an election. So I think it's undeniable. As good as these first few weeks for Trump have been on many fronts, we're still on the same road to Sodom that we were before. But the bus was traveling 1,000 miles per hour under Biden, would have gone up to 1,500 miles per hour under Harris, but is now maybe at like 700 miles per hour under Trump. And it's not going to really. We have to have a severe and massive paradigm shift in order for the bus to not only stop moving down the cliff, but to hit the reverse gear and go back up.
Right.
And I don't think you get that way by just continually going a little bit further down the cliff, just to basically win people over to your side. I'm mixing metaphors now, but I think you get the point. Yeah,
No, I get the point. We have slowed down significantly, but we are far from where we need to be, both morally, culturally, and well, financially, to be honest, as a
yeah.
country. Um, given RFK and Trump's other nominations and Trump's policies, how do you see the abortion fight panning out in the next 4 years?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think really the momentum is going to happen on the state level. So I don't think Trump is going to be making any massive moves toward abolishing abortion. Certainly, the best we can kind of hope for is that he'll leave the state lawmakers alone who are currently trying to do that at the state level. There's a lot of momentum happening in several states. North Dakota, which is a new front for abolition, had a hearing yesterday, and there's several state reps in support of that bill. It's going to get a floor vote just because of how the rules in North Dakota work. But other states like Texas and South Carolina, which have had abolition bills before, are seeing the most support for them ever in massive coalitions of conservative grassroots groups and party leaders, even like pro-life leaders like Abby Johnson, a Roman Catholic woman who until a few years ago was an incrementalist and supported the second victim narrative. Now she's coming out and saying, no, we need to actually abolish abortion and criminalize women who willfully murder their babies. So there's a lot of encouraging fruit happening at the state level. Now, Trump has shown willingness in the past couple of years to weigh into these debates and say, well, I think what Florida is doing is going too far. Or, at one point he criticized DeSantis for having a heartbeat bill and saying it was terrible. If he
Right.
doesn't do that and kind of leaves that alone, I think that's where the progress comes from. If he uses his bully pulpit to come out and say, no, it's too extreme, we need to moderate, even when he doesn't really need to, I think that's where the risk really comes in for Christians.
How do you feel about a national abortion ban, given that in 4 years it may be just completely wiped out or overturned, and then it's back at the federal level? If Trump were to say it is no longer with the states, I am just saying no abortion, it is possible that in 4 years we lose that and it goes back to no, everyone must have abortion. How do you feel about the risk reward ratio with a national abortion ban?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, like most murder law, it should be handled at the state level ideally. If you murder somebody in the state of Pennsylvania where I live, I'm not going to go to federal prison unless I murder a mailman or something.
Right.
I'll go to probably a state prison.
Yeah.
It should be the same way with most things. That's why we have our federal system. The states really are more important than the federal government on an individual level. But I think in terms of the doctrine of lesser magistrates, I think it would be legitimate for a president of the United States to say, hey, this state is allowing for child sacrifice to happen. I'm going to intervene and push for a national ban for that reason. Especially in the case we have right now, where over half the country lives in states where abortion is largely legal or entirely legal in some cases like New York, California. I think it would be legitimate under those circumstances to apply a doctrine of the lesser magistrates sort of framework and say, well, we have the 14th Amendment, which demands equal protection for all persons in our U.S. Constitution, and that's the oath that the president takes is to uphold the U.S. Constitution faithfully. So I think under the framework we're currently in, it would be legitimate. We actually just ran at the Sentinel an open letter from I think 12 of the 23 pro-lifers who Trump pardoned, and they actually did ask him for a national abortion ban. They thanked him. They expressed gratefulness for some of the things he's doing, but they also kind of very respectfully encouraged him to go further and say, we need to just end abortion in our country, and we need your help with that. I don't think it's ideal. I think really it should happen at the state level, but again, what really matters is that there's still over 1 million babies getting murdered every single year in our country under the cover of law. It needs to end one way or another.
Absolutely. How do you think we should play that out? Play our cards as we're seeking to end abortion, so that it is not able to be overturned in 4 years if a Democrat gets reelected.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been movements to codify Roe. We saw it under Biden, of course. There were several bills put in that would basically enshrine the provisions of Roe, and if they can do that, they can certainly go further and say 9 months to do pregnancy, because even under Roe, you weren't really allowed to do a lot of third trimester abortions and things like that. So in terms of, again, I think the where Christians have the most political powers at the local and state level, just because they're smaller and we can exercise more asymmetrical influence at those levels. But on a national scale, really, it's just got to be, you can't let the issue die out. You have to actually make sure that it's important to voters by talking about it. J.D. Vance, is also not perfect on this issue, but of course he's been talking about pro-family policy. He spoke at the March for Life. He's made some gestures towards saying that, abortion is still something we do care about as the Republican Party. And I would encourage him to go further. But I think even the fact that it's being talked about is maybe even the most important thing at that level.
Yeah. You mentioned the North Dakota hearings yesterday. The co-director for the North Dakota Catholic Convention came out in support of abortion. What's going on there, and how come we've got to the point where the co-director of the Catholic Convention is promoting abortion?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the same pattern that's played out for the past decade or so. Across a lot of red states, a lot of blue states too, purple states, but especially red states where the longtime established pro-life groups and lobbyists are coming out and saying we need to oppose equal protection for the preborn because that could criminalize women. That's the phrase they'll use. It's not the phrase that the bills use, but they say it would criminalize women. Really what the bills do is they just say, establish equal protection of the laws for every human being. So if you murder a baby in the womb, you face the same penalty as you would if you murder a 3-month-old baby outside the womb, or a 30-year-old person outside the womb. And it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, an abortionist or what. If you do it willfully, and you go through the legal system and you're innocent until proven guilty, but if you are proven guilty, then you face penalties. Rather than doing that, they would say abortion needs to be legal for women specifically because they're second victims of abortion. There's a lot of lies that surround that. There's actually a lot of studies that would claim that most women are coerced, but if you kind of look under the hood of those studies, the majority of those stats you're looking at are, if they were financially coerced, which means they thought they couldn't afford it, that would never hold up in the court of law for a woman who murders her 1-year-old, for example. So unfortunately, that's it wasn't surprising anything that happened in North Dakota yesterday. It's sort of been par for the course, again, with that steady momentum building for the side of abolition. Actually, in North Dakota, Planned Parenthood came out and opposed that equal protection bill, that abolition bill. So really, you saw, it was fascinating. You had Democrat lawmakers, you had Planned Parenthood, and you had the North Dakota Catholic Conference, and then you had the major pro-life groups all banding together against abolishing abortion. So, it's getting more brazen now that abolitionism, is getting momentum. But again, it's not that surprising.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the looking under the hood of some of those studies. Oftentimes, one of the cases that's made for abortion is in the case of rape or the life of the mother. From your research and the work you've been doing, how much of a problem do you really think that is?
Yeah, it's been well established, and I think even the pro-lifers would certainly say this. It's a very small percentage of abortions that actually happen, 1 or 2% maybe. And actually, if you ask any, I've done this when ministering outside of abortion mills, when just pedestrians walk up and say, "How dare you do this? You want what these women could be getting raped," and I'll say something like, if these women, if we allowed that women who were raped could have abortions, would you say that the other 99% of abortions should be ended? And they would say, no, of course not. And it's like, okay, then why would you bring that up? And it gets back to emotional sabotage, manipulation. Really, they're trying to guilt you into saying that you hate, innocent rape victims who didn't do anything wrong. Now they have to bear the consequences of the rapist's sin. But again, it goes back to, it's not actually a good faith appeal, because they're trying to manipulate you and adopt a standard they don't actually hold, in order to make their point.
You mentioned there's very few in the case of rape in the life of the mother. Obviously, for rape, it doesn't matter how the child was conceived; it's still a human being. For the life of the mother, what are your kind of arguments against people who would use that as something that would be worth aborting the baby?
Yeah, that's another place where we see a lot of emotional manipulation. So a lot when an abolition bill comes up, they'll say that this could confuse doctors and cause them to, not treat women who are having an ectopic pregnancy, or some issue like that. And really, that's, if anything, the media saying that sort of thing is what's causing doctors not to do that, because they think it's true, even though it's not. A lot of these abolition bills, and most pro-life bills even, will say, they'll have explicit clauses saying this has nothing to do with a medical triage situation where a doctor is forced to maybe deliver a baby early, in order to save a mother's life. There's really no situation in which a doctor is required to go into a woman and tear off the baby, limb from limb, in order to save that mother's life. Really, if anything, it's an early delivery. Actually, my wife's stepsister had cancer last year, and she tragically died in the
Oh wow, I'm
fall.
really sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, she passed away in the fall, but she was actually pregnant at the time, so they delivered her baby early, and I think he was 29 weeks, if I remember correctly. But it wasn't ideal. He had to be in the NICU, and it wasn't fun for
Right.
anybody involved. But he's alive, and he's doing great, and the mother is unfortunately passed away. But there are situations like where that does happen, and that's the doctors caring for both human lives, instead of just saying one is more important and the other is subhuman. That's a very different situation.
Yeah, well, I'm really sorry about that, but glad that he's alive and doing well. And it does come back to kind of we are all in God's hands, and I think that's something that we would have to point out in this ultimate debate, that our lives are not our own, and so sometimes sad things happen, but that's what God has given us. So.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
there are many conservatives who I think would love for abortion to be gone. They're generally like, yeah, that'd be great. But at the moment, they're like, there are more pressing issues. How would you rank kind of abortion in the list of problems in our country, and what would your response be to those people?
Yeah, certainly. I think abortion is not only the number one issue that we're facing, but the most foundational issue we're facing. So, if you look at God's heart in the Old Testament, I would contend that you cannot find a more firm word against child sacrifice than you can against any other sin. If you look at a passage like Leviticus 20, where he's talking about Molech worship, and causing children to pass through the fire for Molech, he actually says explicitly, if the people of the land do not oppose this, if they continue allowing this to happen, I will set my face against them too.
Right.
And that's what we're currently seeing. The foundational reason for why we're seeing national judgment beyond, even like the LGBTQ stuff, as bad as it is that we're all over us, all over this country, all over our land, in our neighborhoods, everywhere. There's buildings where women and men can take their children to die because they don't want them. And we're doing nothing about it. Most of us drive by these places on our way to work. And now, of course, it's increasingly shifting toward ordering it through the mail and the abortion pill. But even still, it's legal in most cases in this country, in all 50 states to some extent, it's still legalized child sacrifice. And that's why we're facing the judgment we're facing. And I saw Abolitionist Rising post today, actually, something to the effect of, we can't have a golden age unless we abolish abortion. I think it's exactly correct. It's still a crimson age in America, as much as we may want a golden age if we're still allowing for mass child sacrifice.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the most pressing. I mean, you're murdering people, so that's probably not that's the most important thing is to eliminate that. How would you recommend going about ending abortion, not only on a legal level, but also on a cultural level, so that that kind of thing is not seen as even a viable option? And here I'm talking specifically short of converting everyone to Christians, which we would love,
Yeah,
but that may not be possible here in the next 10, 15 years. Culturally, how do you go about making it so that abortion is seen as like a touche subject?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, as you mentioned, there's the law, but then there's also the culture, and I don't think those things are ever set against each other. I think some Christians try to set them against each other, and I don't think you can really do that, because even if you have, when you pass abolition bills, equal protection bills, when you talk about them publicly, it actually does tutor the culture and say it is murder to kill one of these babies in your womb. So when those laws are discussed, when they're debated and seriously considered, when they're passed into law, you see that steel ball effect take place, where people's views start to shift towards seeing human beings as actually valuable, even when they're in the womb, and even from the earliest stages of conception, not just when they have a heartbeat or something like that. So we're seeing, hopefully, we'll see some of that as that debate continues. But I think broader culturally, I think instead of merely the negative side saying that abortion is bad, don't do that. Also, the positive side of saying families are good, marriage is good, having children is a good thing. So going back to Vance and kind of pronatalism, I think that's a good step in the right direction, most certainly. And Christians upholding the beauty of the natural family, the goodness of marriage, having good marriages themselves, having children themselves, is a really important step in that direction. Just being salt and light, even by our deeds, not just our words. And that being encouraged in federal law, for example, in state law, not incentivizing single mothers in our welfare states. There's lots of things you can do to that effect as well, and just of course the public proclamation of it. And I think we're seeing some movement in that direction of looking at the girl boss who works until she's 40 and freezes her eggs and then finally has kids when it's convenient for her. I think we're starting to see some of the fallout of how unnatural that is, and sort of this shift away from feminism in a lot of cases. And I think that's helpful, and I think Christians can and should continue leading that conversation, away from sort of the artificial ideologies we have over the natural world and God's good design for men and women in marriage and things like that. So it's multifaceted, and law and culture aren't set against one another. Law feeds into culture. Culture, of course, feeds into law, and Christians can and should be active in improving both.
Yeah, there are a lot of conservatives who, after Roe v. Wade, kind of saw that as like that's pretty good, more or less dusted. Let's move on to other problems. Why do you think conservatives are struggling to just kill it dead and be done with this issue forever?
Right. Yeah, I think it's part of it is the established pro-life movements, and they're sort of used to, they're pretty satisfied with shutting down the abortion mills. They think that means the battle's kind of been won. Whereas they're kind of ignoring the fact of self-managed abortion pills coming through the mail, not really making a firm effort to do that. They're kind of starting to in some cases, like Students for Life, for example, is trying to pass bills that specifically will oppose the abortion pill and try to make them illegal. But again, they work in those clauses into their bills that say this is not applied to a woman who wants to kill her child. They literally say that in the bills. So there needs to be a further paradigm shift in that direction, not toward regulating abortion or a certain method of abortion, but criminalizing the act of abortion. So if you willfully take a preborn human life, just as if you take a born life, you face penalties under the law for murder. I think the other unfortunate reality of Roe, it was good to overturn Roe. Dobbs, I would say, is not a just decision. It wasn't in line with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. I don't think it was constitutional either. But after Roe was overturned, which was a victory for the pro-life movement, 50 years
Huge,
of
yeah.
fighting for it. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the temptation is to think that the battle has been won, and to say
Right.
now that Roe's over, we've kind of won on this issue. We can move on to greener pastures. But actually, you've seen over the past couple of years, abortion has increased in America more than before Roe. So we're actually at the highest levels we've seen in about a decade in terms of child sacrifice in this country, more than we had even under Roe. And I don't think we've really grappled with that reality. I think most people have just assumed that Roe was the law of the land, so to speak, instead of just a court opinion. The states work within the Roe paradigm, but Roe itself never was the thing that was keeping abortion legal. It was the laws of the state and the lack of enforcement of state laws. Even some states had laws in the books that did criminalize abortion, but under Roe they just didn't enforce them. And then the pro life movement itself actually came back later and got rid of those laws and replaced them with crappy regulations. That happened in a state like Arizona, for example. It was actually a criminal act for abortionists and for mothers to kill babies. And then I believe it was the pro life movement was the one that got rid of the one for women a few years ago, and then just this past year, kind of a coalition of a couple lefty Republicans, and then the Democrats came in and got rid of the other one that criminalized abortionists. So yeah, the victory has not been won. We need to keep fighting and pressing our advantage and our momentum on abortion as well.
This seems to be a common conservative problem. We mentioned the LGBTQ movement earlier. That in the aftermath of COVID, a lot of conservatives woke up and kind of said, "Right, we've got a tree of thorns in our garden. Why don't we
Yeah.
chop off all the largest branches?" However, we still seem to have left the stock intact. What would your encouragement be to conservatives in light of that kind of lack of ability to follow through?
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right. Like Deuteronomy does talk about cutting down the root of Sodom. I haven't looked at that passage in a while, but it does seem to have a zero tolerance policy toward sodomy, toward transgenderism, all these things we're seeing. I think we need to exercise the Boniface option, right? As has been discussed frequently in our circles, where instead of cutting off the branches and chopping off the little twigs and plucking off the leaves of the tree of degeneracy and sin, we just take an axe to the root, come what may.
Yeah.
And if you look at the historical account of Boniface, just his act of boldness after, the hagiography says at least that after one stroke of his axe, a mighty wind came from heaven and pushed down that tree. So he didn't actually really need to continue swinging. It was just, in God's providence, in his grace, those efforts were blessed, even supernaturally, possibly. So I think we'll see that sort of tailwind in our sales as well if we just start acting consistently with what God has said, and we'll see momentum in that direction if we just seek to obey Him first and foremost, fear Him rather than man.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to chopping down the tree and offending lots of people.
Yes.
And Lord willing, it will be a mighty fall. You we were talking earlier about the Trump's nominations. You were part of. Well, I'll shift focus a little bit. Actually, no, I had one more question. Sorry. Do you think is there anything on the books? Will there be anything on the books in the upcoming year or so that would make a fetus, a baby, as soon as conception happens, a human? I feel like that would be a good way to kind of go about bringing that the abortion into the conversation of murder. Is there anything on the books that would dictate that?
Yeah, certainly. So all these abolition bills are doing that inherently by what they're trying to do. They have to define person as from conception. Actually, Trump did have an executive order on the one on sex and gender, and basically saying that it's the official policy of the U.S. government that there's only two sexes. It did actually say
From conception.
male from
Yeah.
conception. Excellent move. That's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem with it's good. The issue is there needs to be enforcement. So there's actually been a personhood movement for quite a few years now in the United States that has it's almost like a proto abolitionist movements where they've sort of seen some of the issues with the pro lifism and regulationism, and they've passed resolutions to say that all humans are persons from conception. The issue though is you can say that and that's great, but you have to actually have laws that reflect that. So if you do that without repealing the parts of the homicide code that exempt abortion from the penalties therein, you haven't really done anything. You've catechized the culture. That's great, and you've sort of you have moved the conversation, but abortion doesn't actually end until the actual code of the law that says that you cannot be penalized for killing somebody in the womb ends. So yeah, it's good to proclaim that babies, fetuses are human from conception, but you really need to follow through with the enforcement in the law too.
Yeah. Shifting focus a little bit, you were part of the news that broke yesterday about USAID and a lot of the money that's going to mega churches. Can you kind of break down exactly what's happening there, exactly what we found?
Absolutely, yeah. So with USAID getting, as Elon Musk said, thrown into the wood chipper, which is a really great way to describe it. I love that. of course, all the woke programs they've been funding around the world, gender therapy in Pakistan, and drag shows in Uganda or whatever. All those are sort of swirling around the public conversation. And in that, all the Christians who have been rightly criticizing Christianity today, Revoice, all these organizations, have just basically looked at the data and figured out that a lot of these groups are taking a lot of federal money, or if they're not taking federal money, it's sort of this patronage network where USAID and groups like it are funding the Rockefeller Center and defending
Right.
democracy, and then those dollars end up filtering down to some of those organizations. Another good example is the After Party, Redeeming Babel, which was Curtis Chang, Russell Moore, and David French basically pushing progressive politics under the guise of a Bible study curriculum into the church. So we're basically learning that all of our enemies are funded by Uncle Sam, and so it's not merely an organic movement to shift the conservative Christian world to the left. It's actually more steering. There are people getting paid and having financial incentives in order to basically enforce the will of the regime onto the church instead of encouraging the regime to see the world as the church does. So that's sort of what's going on right now. Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple mega churches received funds from these people. How do we make sure that, well, first off, how did we get to the point where our churches are being funded by the U.S. government in order to push their ideology, the woke ideology? And how do we make sure that that kind of thing doesn't resurrect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think arguably with the PPP funding a couple years ago, that maybe even softened our consciences toward taking money from the government. There was a big debate in my church whether or not to take that money to keep people employed or whatever. Sort of help in a tough financial time. But I think that's actually a legitimate way in which separation of church and state in the true sense should happen. Of course, the leftists like to abuse that phrase and say separation of church and state means you can't have a Christian view on abortion or sodomy or
Right.
whatever actually impact the public
Right.
square. Really what it means is the church and the state are separate institutions, both under God, but with different mandates. They both have to obey God, but they shouldn't, exercise undue influence on each other. So,
Yeah.
in the same way that you shouldn't have a bishop running, casting votes in Congress on behalf of your national church, something like that. You shouldn't have the state giving money to church organizations, because what that's going to do is it's going to just basically make them mirror whatever the church is, or whatever the state is doing, rather. And even beyond just individual megachurches, things like that, it's this vast network of parachurch ministries and nonprofits, and we're actually learning with this whole USAID situation that it's these woke nonprofits that are sort of the slush fund for the leftist agenda. It's why you sort of saw like a bank run on USAID the other day. All these Democrats are running to the headquarters like it was a run on the bank, and for them it actually was a run on the bank,
Yep.
because a lot of them, all their friends are getting money from this single woke agency, and Elon really put his finger on it, and caused some pressure to occur. So yeah, it's the antidote is actual true separation of church and state, and I think just shining a light on everything that's been going on. And Megan Basham did that last year with her book, and so really she was vindicated quite a lot, as everybody was looking for themselves all this data that's coming out. But that's the answer is actually having a true separation of church and state in this country.
Yeah, and that separation of church and state originally meant that there's not going to be a church state like in England. There's the Church of England, and that's kind of what they wanted to avoid. We're not separating morality and state, obviously,
Right.
because then there's no God above the state, then the state is God. But that separation of the church and state was more meant as a protection against having a church state, which it seems we somehow got to anyway,
Yeah.
with the church funding states the states funding churches, and getting there. For the people who are in those churches who are now kind of waking up to that moment, how do they handle this, and then how do they make sure that this kind of thing, they what are the signs they should be looking for that this kind of thing is happening again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you see any church leaders try to move away from financial transparency, that's a really bad sign. So the question you just asked, a lot of SBC members are currently asking, a lot of SBC pastors and churches are asking. Financial transparency has been a big issue in the SBC for a few years. Actually, last year I was at the convention in Indianapolis, and there was a movement to actually pass. I believe it was, I can't remember if it was a resolution or amendment. Those are different in the SBC, but basically to require SBC institutions to publish the same kind of data that a nonprofit would publish in a 990 form, something like that. And you had the platform, all the institutional leaders in the SBC making up reasons for why that's not a good idea. And it's like, why would that not be a good idea? Every other nonprofit in America is required to do that by law, or at least should do that by law. And you're asking churches to give tithe dollars given by Christian grandmas and faithful working fathers, and then forking it over into this vast money furnace of an institution where you have no idea where it's going. When you have that sort of thing happening, immediately alarm bells should be raised. So I actually know a couple of really solid SBC pastors who want to really fight for those institutions and win them back, and make sure they're transparent, make sure they're conservative. But they're also kind of looking and saying, with all the money we're forking over in the cooperative program, we could be doing our own church planting. We could hire another pastor. We could give to more missionaries overseas that we know and we send. So I don't know if there's one answer for everybody. I think it's a very legitimate and lively fight within the SBC to win it back, and to purge the woke influences and the left steerage. But again, there's also institutions in the SBC that are taking money from these vast nonprofit NGO sort of networks. Like the ERLC has, I believe, taken grant money from those sorts of groups, and they've pushed for things like building mosques, or allowing mosques to be built alongside Muslims, and questions start to be raised concerning that. So really, the more information, the better. The more sunlight, the better. But really, I think it falls down to the conscience of every Christian. If they're in a church that's been taking money like that, do you stay? Do you try to become an elder or a deacon or something that can have influence and move the church in a better direction? It really just depends on your conscience and the opportunities before you.
Yeah, and it's an unfortunate situation that a lot of these people have to be suspicious in church. We would rather that not be the
Yeah,
case.
yeah.
But unfortunately, for a lot of them, that is where they are at the moment. Some of the other news that broke a couple days ago over this past week has been Trump announcing that the United States would be taking over the Gaza Strip. What's happening there, and what do you think what do you think is the game he's playing?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, on its face, I don't like that idea.
No.
I think, yeah, getting involved in the Middle East has always been a bad idea for us, especially, we're already pretty involved in Israel. They've actually been I think the number one recipient of U.S. aid for the past 80 years since World War II. So there's that issue at play, forking over hundreds of billions of dollars to a foreign state. But, he's talking about things like moving the people out of that area. I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, there's debates over the two-state solution, or what to do with the Gazans, the fact that they are broadly in support of terrorism toward Israel. It's not a good situation. I don't know if the answer is moving them all out and building a bunch of golden Trump towers along the Mediterranean Sea. My instinct is just to stay out of it. I think that's what America should do. Give $0 in aid to either side of that conflict. There's a meme that's been going around for a few months now, where it's a bunch of missiles flying toward Israel and a bunch of Iron Dome missiles coming back out to defend them, and it says, "My tax dollars also somehow
Also,
my tax
somehow,
dollars."
yeah,
Yeah, that's
love
sort of
that.
what the U.S. has been for a long time in foreign policy,
Yes.
and it's good to see movement away from that. But on the other hand, it could just very well be Trump negotiating. We saw that play out with Canada and Mexico, and them making concessions, and Trump lifting the tariffs at least temporarily while better deals are hammered out. It could very well be that he's trying to do something like that. Negotiations, of course, are ongoing in that part of the world, and Steve Witkoff from the Trump administration is involved in that. So I'd say we just wait and see. On an objective level, I don't like the idea. I think it's a terrible idea. But at the same time, it's probably not a done deal yet.
Yeah, I'd rather be involved in less foreign wars as a general rule. I kind of wonder if Trump is playing the Solomon card and like, all right, I'll split the baby down the middle. It's mine now, and just to see if they make up. I
Yeah.
guess we will see if that plays out. Do you think Trump being shot is a legitimate concern this time around? Obviously, he was shot in the lead up to the election, but now that he has been elected, do you think that's something that he should be concerned and worried about?
Yeah, I think that there's probably plenty of people who want to kill him right now, especially pretty entrenched state interests now that he's going after the foreign policy slash fund and the Department of Education. There are a lot of very powerful people who probably don't like the idea of him, as Elon said, putting agencies into the wood chipper. Right, we're only a few weeks in, and USAID might be gone this weekend. On Monday there might not be a USAID anymore,
Which would be
and
lovely.
which would be absolutely lovely. Yes, for sure. Um, but again, I don't think the deep state will stand for that. I think they'll pull something. I don't know if it'll be killing him this time. They tried it a few months ago and it didn't quite work out by divine providence, but we'll see.
Yeah, we will see, most certainly, and it should be an interesting 4 years to say the least. And Lord willing, we can put things in place over the course of these next 4 years that will stand a little longer than they have before. One of the tricky and also blessings of the United States government is that we only get 4 years, potentially 8 of a presidency, and then we're back to who knows. What's your encouragement, given our conversation and everything that's happening out there, to anyone watching?
Absolutely. It's been really encouraging to see a lot of Christians saying that no matter where you fall in a lot of these questions, now is the time to build. We have 4 years, or maybe 2 years, but with the midterms, but at least 4 years where there's momentum on our side, and we're protected broadly from the kind of federal overreach we saw under Biden and under the Democrats. So we have some space to build. So the mistake that we can make right now is thinking that we won just because we have our guy in the White House. What we need to do is build on the local level, the state level, move the ball forward with policy, with cultural institutions like churches, schools, businesses. All that sort of stuff is what we need to be doing. And the challenge of it is it's sort of like the Order of Morris conversation. Like, first you care about your family, then your broader family, then your community, then your church, then your nation, and so forth. We have to almost sort of go back to that framework of saying, instead of constantly caring about what's going on federally or nationally, what can I do at a lower level, more local level? First of all, my own church and my own family, but then even my own state government, and then finally the national government. It's not wrong to be informed on those things, but in terms of, share of effort, you should put your effort where you can actually make the greatest impact the fastest. So a good step is, going to the state level instead of to push policies, or email your lawmakers when you see them doing good work, instead of merely just stressing about what's going on federally and that sort of thing. But I think that's the answer is us rolling up our sleeves and putting our hands to the plow.
What have been your solutions to kind of only pay attention to the things that matter in such a crazy world? I mean, I think it was earlier this week or last week, we had 2 planes crash, and it seems to have already been wiped off our minds. What are your encouragements and pieces of advice? How have you managed to pay attention to the things that matter on social media, and then kind of block the rest out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because my job is to write about the news, so I'm constantly
Right.
consuming news during my workday at least. I think the answer is just logging off, touching grass from time to time. So I've been trying to put my phone away on Sundays for the whole Lord's Day, things like that. Getting more involved in service with the church, and evangelism, public evangelism. If there are ways for you to kind of step away from the online milieu and be with other Christians, it's always a good step, and with your family too. Doing family worship and hanging out with your wife, taking her on dates. Valentine's Day is coming up, that sort of thing. Always a good step.
Yeah. You mentioned your work writing newsletters and such. Where can people find you and your work online?
You can find us at republicsentinel.com. So that's our news outlet, conservative news and commentary owned and operated by Christians. You can find me on X. It's just at Ben Zeisloft. And then I'll have a book coming out in a few months here, about basically the history of the pro-life movement killing equal protection efforts at the state level. So like we're talking about with drilling down to the more state and local, that's really the focus in the book, but looking at how it's a national trend, and this is a broader entrenched issue in the pro-life world.
Where will people be able to find that, and when is the plan for that to come out?
I believe in next, I think March or April. We're recording this in early February. I think March or April. I don't know if I can quite reveal who's publishing it yet, but it will have a publisher. People will recognize the publisher, and they can get it there or presumably on Amazon.
Fantastic. Ben, thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the chance to talk.
See you guys.